In this lecture, Dr. Malhotra discusses sugar activism or sugar advocacy.
But I'm very happy to be here, and it's a pleasure to speak to you today and spread my view of the world. So I'm going to talk to you about action on sugar. So one of my roles is being the science director of an organization called Action on Sugar, which I will talk about shortly. And the title is Action on Sugar, Advocacy or Activism. So, you've seen this probably several times, but, it never ceases to really shock me, the statistics around obesity. So in the UK, 2/3 of adults are now overweight or obese, and it's thought that this will double by 2050. We'll get to 90%. And 1/3 of children, for me, is more disturbing. By the time they leave primary school, are also overweight or obese. And obesity itself is costing the NHS around £5 billion per year, and that's set to increase. Type 2 diabetes, which in many ways is probably a bigger problem, is actually costing our NHS 20 billion, well, directly and indirectly costing the UK 20 billion pounds per year, and that's set to double by 2035. And I just want to emphasize this. I know some of you would have been here yesterday. It's a completely different talk, just so you know, but there's a few slides that are similar. And one of the things that I think we haven't fully acknowledged or appreciated is actually the root cause around this is the food environment. We have sugary foods everywhere that become unavoidable. Whether you go to the gas station, whether you're in a gym, sugary drinks, junk food, it's very difficult to avoid it. And we know the main root cause behind the obesity epidemic is the food environment. We have too much processed food, it's unavoidable, and therefore we consume it. For me, this is the biggest scandal, really. And this is where, for me, this is where the campaign began. As a doctor treating people with heart disease, I remember treating somebody for a heart attack in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. And the next day on the ward round, he was basically being served junk food. I was trying to talk to him about lifestyle. I thought, this doesn't make sense. And he said to me, Doc, how do you expect me to change my lifestyle when you're serving me the same crap that brought me in here in the first place? And he was absolutely right. Now, let's talk about sugar. Why should we pick on poor old sugar? Well, in 1972, a British nutritionist called John Yudkin wrote a book called Pure, White and Deadly. And he actually went against the prevailing view at the time, which was being perpetrated by an American scientist called Ancel Keys, who felt that saturated fat was the main culprit in heart disease. And when the new dietary guidelines were introduced, the food industry took advantage of that message, naturally, and started to market lots of low-fat products and started loading them with lots of sugar. They didn't like John Yudkin's view, because he felt that actually, up till the 1850s, we'd hardly consume sugar at all. It was very, very much an occasional treat, and in fact, sugar consumption increased quite dramatically after the 1850s, whereas we'd been consuming lots of saturated fat for centuries. So he didn't think that was the issue. And he was hung out to dry. Obviously, the sugar industry didn't like what he said, and they used various methods to impede his work. And he talks about this in his book, Pure, White and Deadly, and if you haven't read it, I think you should read it. They interfered with his research funding and publications. He was disinvited from conferences. And Ancel Keys attacked him as well publicly and tried to demonize him. And the case against sugar was discredited. In fact, it was so successful a PR campaign that very few, if any, scientists were willing to write and publish anything criticizing sugar because they were fearful that it would discredit them and that would be the end of their careers. And that was it. John Yudkin died in 1995. His warnings were no longer taken seriously for the next 3 decades until this man comes along, Robert Lustig, pediatric endocrinologist in the University of California, San Francisco. And he does a lecture on YouTube, which goes on YouTube. It's an hour-and-a-half lecture called Sugar the Bitter Truth. 2009 has now got over 5 million views. I saw this lecture. I was fascinated. And up to this point, I hadn't had much interest in the sugar issue. I wasn't even aware of it. So I started looking into doing my own research and looking at papers. The first thing I learned was sugar has absolutely no nutritional value whatsoever. And contrary to what the food industry want you to believe, you do not need any carbohydrate for energy from added sugar at all. There's no biological requirement for it. So that's the first message that needs to come across. And then we have the whole issue around fructose. And I looked at Lustig's work, and other people that had published on it as well. And the common wisdom is that a calorie is a calorie, and sugar is just empty calories. But we know there is good evidence that chronic fructose exposure promotes liver fat accumulation, which promotes the metabolic syndrome. And what's a metabolic syndrome? Well, it's specifically, the most common definition is three of high blood pressure, abnormal glucose, such as insulin resistance or impaired glucose tolerance or having type 2 diabetes, increased triglycerides, decreased HDL, and increased waist circumference. You have three of those, then you've got metabolic syndrome. And for me as a cardiologist, that's important because actually 66% of people admitted with a heart attack actually have the metabolic syndrome. And if you have the metabolic syndrome and you have a heart attack, you're 50% more likely to be readmitted within a year or die. So it's a very important aspect which has been neglected. And a lot of the talks so far have actually emphasized the fact that refined carbohydrates are the biggest driver of metabolic syndrome. Sugar is one of those. So there's also a bit of misinformation around the whole obesity problem. Actually, for me, obesity is just the tip of the iceberg. A lot of people I treat aren't particularly obese. In fact, they're not even overweight. They'll have the increased waist circumference. They'll have metabolic syndrome. And in fact, that's very important, especially when it comes to sugar. So this is a slightly crude slide, but it's taken from a reference in Robert Lustig's commentary in Nature, which is a very prestigious medical journal. And it really makes the point that actually 40% of normal weight people, 40% of people with a normal body mass index will ultimately go on to develop the diseases associated with metabolic syndrome. Therefore, all vulnerable. And I said yesterday that poor diet, according to the Lancet Global Burden of Disease reports, poor diet contributes to more disease than physical inactivity, smoking, and alcohol combined. Right, here's the fiction. What did Coca-Cola say? Well, they say beating obesity will take action by all of us based upon one simple common sense fact. All calories count, no matter where they come from, including Coca-Cola and everything else with calories. That's their message. That's what they've been perpetrating for a long time. It's been very successful for them. What does the science tell us? Well, actually, some calories cause more disease than others. A calorie is not a calorie. Fiber, let's take fiber. You eat 160 calories of almonds, you'll absorb 130 of those calories. Protein, we know that the body uses twice as much energy to metabolize protein than it does carbohydrate. Fat, or if you have a calorie from omega-3, it's going to protect you from a heart attack. You have a calorie from trans fats, it's going to increase the risk of a heart attack. And fructose. So are all calories the same? Well, I spoke to a chap who gave me this quote for an article I wrote in The Guardian, and this is what he said, and I'll reveal who it is in a minute. It is extremely naive of the public and the medical profession to imagine that a calorie of bread, a calorie of meat, and a calorie of alcohol are dealt in the same way by the amazingly complex systems of the body. The assumption has been made that increased fat in the bloodstream is caused by increased saturated fat in the diet, whereas modern scientific evidence is proving that refined carbohydrates and sugar in particular are actually the culprits. Who do you think said this? Some extremist maverick on the periphery? No. This is the chair of the National Obesity Forum of the UK, Professor David Haslam. A study then came out a couple of years ago when I was looking into all of this. It was called the EPIC Interact study. And what this found, which is very interesting, is that it was a study done across Europe looking at about 16,000 people. It was an observational study, but it was very high quality. And what they found is that consumption of just one sugary drink per day was associated with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes by about 22%. But what was particularly interesting about this is it was independent of body mass index. So even if you were not obese, you still had that increased risk. And that's, again, a message we need to keep reinforcing. It's not about obesity, it's about a metabolic syndrome. This study, I think, was fascinating. So PLOS ONE came out of Stanford University. Sanjay Basu was the lead author, American physician. Robert Lustig was also one of the co-authors. And what they looked at was 175 countries worldwide over a decade. And they looked at sugar availability and consumption. And what they found was that for every excess 150 calories one would consume, typical of a can of cola, above your normal quota, compared to calories from another source, such as fat or protein, there was an 11-fold increase of the prevalence of type 2 diabetes. But again, this is very interesting. This was independent of BMI and physical activity. Okay? You cannot outrun a bad diet. I'm sorry. So I was curious, looking at all this research and reading about it, and I thought, well, how much sugar should we be consuming? So I went back and looked at what did the American Heart Association say. And they published a statement in 2009, and they said that it recommended, because anything above this was associated with metabolic syndrome, increased risk, that actually the current average American was consuming at least 22 teaspoons of sugar a day, and this should be reduced to 9 for the average male and 6 for a female. So I thought this was really interesting because my own observations were that people were consuming a lot more than that. So I thought I'd look at the nutritional guidelines in the UK and in Europe. But before I did that, I picked up a can of Coke one day just to look at how much sugar was in it. And now I know, and I knew this, that a can of Coca-Cola, a 330ml can, has 9 teaspoons of sugar. But this hasn't changed, and this is the same in Europe. And I looked at the label, and it says sugar is 35 grams, which is about 9 teaspoons. This represents 39% of your guideline daily amount. This suggests that you can be consuming 22.5 teaspoons of sugar per day, and that's what you should be having, and this is added sugar. How does that make sense? So I looked at the nutritional guidelines, and I started researching this myself, and I noticed that, so in 2003, the World Health Organization said added sugar should be no more than 10% of energy. And intrinsic sugars should be 10%. So intrinsic sugars are basically sugars you find in whole fruit and vegetables. And at this stage, that isn't an issue. That isn't the major issue at the moment. But added sugar clearly was for me. But the current UK labeling obviously is very misleading, suggesting that actually they put all sugars together. They don't differentiate between intrinsic and added sugars. Now, in the United States, I'd gone over to America and I'd met Robert Lustig, and he wasn't aware of any of this stuff about the labeling in Europe. And what I found over there, which is very interesting, when I looked at food labeling over there, they don't have the equivalent GDA for sugar. They call it RDI, reference dietary intake, because they don't consider sugar a nutrient. Therefore, it's not on the labeling. Therefore, it's very difficult for consumers in the States to actually know how much sugar they should be consuming when they pick up any kind of food item. And also, what's very interesting, good studies had been done. They revealed, actually, in terms of the United States sugar consumption, a third come from sugary drinks, about 6 from ice cream, so foods that we associate as being junk, chocolates, candy bars, whatever. But actually, half of sugar consumption came from non-junk foods, foods that people wouldn't really think had sugar in them, such as salad dressings, bread, ketchup. And that's quite staggering. So 50% of those sugar consumed in America is actually hidden sugar. The US Department of Agriculture realized this, and they put up a website, which I thought was good. At least consumers who wanted to know how much sugar was in foods could go to this website, and actually they were able to try and estimate how much added sugar was in food. But then it got removed. And the reason it got removed is because, and there was a statement put on the website saying, no method can analyze for added sugars, so their amounts must be extrapolated or supplied by the food companies, many of which are not willing to make public such proprietary information. Really? What else had the food industry been doing? I call this a corporate playbook of big sugar. And when people talk about regulating the food industry against their excesses, and I've been one of those people, they have they have a script. Actually, I mean, it's for me, it's very obvious now. But one of the things is they emphasize physical activity over diet for obesity. But we know actually physical activity levels in the United States, from very good studies, haven't changed much in 30 years as obesity has rocketed. And to be honest, at best, there's a very weak link between physical inactivity and obesity. I would say, actually, we shouldn't even use it in the same sentence. The obesity epidemic is all about the types of calories we're consuming. That's not to say don't do physical activity. I'm an active sportsman myself. I believe in so many health benefits of being active. There's no doubt about that. But we should dissociate it from physical activity. There's no good evidence for it. It's been misappropriated by the food industry. And let's learn from history. So it took 50 years from when the first links between smoking and lung cancer were published in the British Medical Journal to any effective regulation. And that's because of a very successful strategy adopted by the tobacco industry, which included planting doubt that their products were harmful, complete denial, confusing the public in such a way, and also buying the loyalty of scientists, whatever it takes to protect their only interest, which is profit and not your health. And the extent of that denialism actually was in 1994, just to emphasize this, the CEOs of every major tobacco company went in front of US Congress and swore under oath that they did not believe nicotine was addictive or smoking caused lung cancer. Now that's denialism, and we should remember that. So I put all of this together in a piece I wrote in the British Medical Journal called The Dietary Advice on Added Sugar Needs Emergency Surgery, which they press released. Putting all of this in, the corporate playbook of big food, etc. It got a lot of coverage. It was picked up by the BBC, several newspapers, and I want to thank Tim, but I haven't thanked him properly for this, because I know Tim actually enlightened me. He was involved in a very interesting, very important investigation which was done by the British Medical Journal, Deborah Cohen, who's the investigations editor, and Tim helped with that, actually exposing the manipulations around sports drinks that for most people, they don't enhance performance and are not necessarily what you need for rehydration. And in fact, that actually personally helped me, because up to that point, I'd been consuming Lucozade every day when I went to the gym, thinking it was good for me. And I calculated that over a period of about 10 years, Tim, I probably spent about £7,000 just on Lucozade. And once I stopped drinking it, I just took water, my performance, I could still run 5K in the same time, nothing changed, so I knew he was right. And Tim gave us this quote, actually, for the press release, and I think this is very pertinent again, that users need to understand that exercise may not protect them from the negative consequences of an excess of sugar intake, and the science supports that. You can't outrun an excessive sugar, unless you're an elite athlete, as we know. For most people, it's not going to be good for you. It's going to do you more harm than good. So this got press released, and it got good pickup and coverage. And then I went on BBC Breakfast, which was one of the primetime breakfast channels, to discuss this. And I was very happy to talk to this with any food industry executives. But Bill Turnbull said at the end of the discussion, when I explained all of this, he said we should add that we did ask 10 different companies or organizations associated with carbonated beverages, supermarkets, sugar manufacturers, to discuss it with Dr. Malhotra. All of them were unavailable. It was a real shame. I was really looking forward to having a discussion with them. So we then formed Action on Sugar. I won't bore you, there's a lot of people here. But I then got contacted by a chap called Professor Graham McGregor, who's a very well-respected physician in England, who'd been campaigning on salt reduction for a number of years. And he was also looking at sugar and thought there was an issue. And he said, listen, we need to form an organization here, and let's do something about this. So we formed a coalition of experts, a lot of very well-known names and respected people from around the world. Robert Lustig was there, David Haslam, professor of the chair of the National Obesity Forum, and Professor Philip James, who's been very big on nutrition for a long time, Yoni Friedhoff, some of you may recognize these names. So we formed Action on Sugar, and then we decided that we were going to do something about this. So the aims of Action on Sugar, very briefly, was, we made a kind of statement ready to go, ready for the media, is one, to achieve a reduction in refined added sugar intake in the UK, so to about 6 teaspoons a day, which was really what the World Health Organization were going to recommend, to 5% of your calories. And then reach a consensus with food manufacturers by making sure that they reduce the amount of sugar they're adding to processed foods. To make sure there was comprehensive nutritional labeling of added sugar. I think that's very important. This distinction that doesn't exist at the moment is really quite scandalous. To educate the public about becoming more aware of sugar. At that point, there wasn't really much awareness in the media about the issues around sugar. And ensure children in particular are highlighted as being a vulnerable group. And also to look at the body of scientific evidence about the dangers of this, about refined added sugar consumption, and that making sure that science gets translated into policy. And that would obviously mean engaging with the government and ensuring that they're aware of all of this. And a parliamentary campaign was also discussed. So in that time, from me publishing that paper, I then published this editorial saying saturated fat is not the major issue, because I obviously realized that saturated fat had been unfairly demonized. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. I think you know most of it already. But essentially, I did feel that we had completely neglected sugar, and saturated fat wasn't the major issue. And that got a lot of coverage and also enhanced that message around sugar again. So we then launched Action on Sugar, and we were preparing for that, a website, a press release, which was in early January. And we got a lot of coverage, actually. So, this was one of the headlines, and it was picked up everywhere. One of the things that we put out in the press release was that to actually make people aware that Coca-Cola has 9 teaspoons of added sugar. And a lot of sugars were hidden in foods people wouldn't normally associate as having sugar in them or being bad for you. And that was it, front page of the Daily Mail newspaper, the most online read newspaper in the world. And that was really one of our successes. They put sugar is the new tobacco. And actually was taken from a quote from Professor Simon Capewell, who's one of the members of Action on Sugar. And it wasn't the full quote, and some people initially came back saying, hold on a minute, guys, really? Sugar, tobacco? Is it that bad? Actually, there were several quotes given. The specific quote from Simon Capewell was this, and I think that's very relevant. And that really is that everywhere sugary drinks and junk foods are now pressed on unsuspecting parents and children by a cynical industry focused on profit, not on health. Very good coverage in the Daily Mail, picked up worldwide, as you can see there. Lots of coverage, which was great, getting the message out there. Again, ongoing, very good coverage. This was going very well. Major news channels covering it. There's a program called BBC Radio 4 by a very respected journalist called John Humphreys. He was on our side. He did a very good interview with one of our members, and we were giving lots of media interviews around this. And the coverage was then fading away, and then by midday, the Empire Strikes Back. Now, if you don't know who this is Andrew Lansley. Andrew Lansley was a former Secretary of State for Health. And he was actually a politician he was a Conservative Party politician, he still is, but he has been quite heavily criticized by the medical profession in the UK as being named or critiqued by a few people as being the chief destroyer of our National Health Service because he got an act passed in Parliament that would allow more private provision in healthcare, which most of the doctors in the UK didn't think was a good idea, it wasn't good for patients. And so he, in Parliament, on the same day, it was quite amazing, he came out and in fact, another MP from the Labour Party, Keith Vars, had actually supported us. He passed an early day motion supporting Action on Sugar and saying we should do something about this, and we agree with Action on Sugar's aims. And what Andrew Lansley said was, he says, this is contempt, he wants to dismiss this sugar as a new tobacco. He said the analogy between sugar and tobacco is not appropriate. Sugar is essential to food. Really, Andrew? Well, so this happened, at the beginning of the week, and then I thought we should hit back. So I would call it Return of the Population Health Jedis. So then I published an article in The Observer on the Sunday, because I knew about Andrew Lansley's links to food companies. What was written was Andrew Lansley attempted to rubbish respected public health expert Professor Simon Capewell's statement that sugar is a new tobacco. Lansley then compounded his errors by ignorantly asserting in the House that sugar is essential to food. It is not. He would have been more accurate in saying sugar is essential to food industry profits and lining the pockets of its co-opted partners. Lansley was a paid director of marketing company Profero to the end of 2009. Profero's clients have included Pepsi, Mars, Pizza Hut, and Diageo's Guinness. This was published in The Observer and got a good coverage, and it was good to get that message across. So the media interest continues, lots of different magazines, women's journals, everyone's interested in sugar now, which is fantastic for us. And then, completely unexpectedly, and this is really interesting, coming back to the buying scientists, there was an exposure in the Sunday Times that the sugar watchdog works for Coca-Cola and Mars. So what they found was the chief of the UK's Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition that is advising us on what we should eat had actually been exposed as taking millions of research funding from Coca-Cola and Mars, and that was then covered the following day in a program called Dispatches. They also found that 5 of the 8 members of this committee also had very worrying links to food industry executives. Because one thing that got to me when I was looking at this myself, I thought, well, hold on a minute. We have this evidence out there about the effects of added sugar and how much we should be consuming. How have these guys sat there and allowed the nutritional labeling to be so misleading? For me, I just thought that was scandalous. And anyway, maybe there's an answer in that. So again, more media around this, which was very important, and media was certainly supporting us overall. And then the World Health Organization then came out actually and recommended then that added sugar should be reduced, the actual calories from added sugar should be reduced from 10% of calories to 5%, which was fantastic. So that was a draft recommendation. Britain's chief medical officer came out in April, and she proposed a sugar tax. And what was interesting about this is there was a study around the same time done by Oxford researchers, and what they found was that if there was, they estimated that if we had a 20% tax on sugary drinks to reduce consumption, in keeping with what happened with tobacco in the past, that would prevent about 200,000 people in the UK becoming overweight or obese within a year. So clearly that was an important message, and Sally Davis was fantastic, supported us in that as well. BMJ did some more articles as well, calling for health warnings on labels on sugary drinks. Simon Capewell published a very good editorial on that. And then we attained a meeting with the actual health secretary that exists at the moment, Jeremy Hunt, and he asked to see us. So we went to see him. Fortunately or unfortunately, I'd probably agree with the latter. The same day we went to see Jeremy Hunt with Action on Sugar, the Daily Mail did a front page story actually saying that government ministers in the last 2 or 3 years had had about 99 meetings with executives of the Food and Drink Federation, but had not a single meeting with any doctors about discussing about obesity, what to do about it. So he wasn't very happy about that because he was on the front page of the Daily Mail, but he was still very cordial, very good, and we had a good discussion with him, and he asked us for a plan to tackle childhood obesity. And this is really the plan, and essentially it was merely to reduce added sugars in processed food, to get the food industry across the board to reduce it by about 40%. And according to the Department of Health, they said that would be enough to reverse the obesity epidemic if that happened across the population in 5 years. Still hasn't happened, but certainly it's been on the agenda. And then, again, more coverage, SACN, and under pressure, Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, actually then come out with a report, and they agree with the World Health Organization that we should reduce the sugar consumption to 5%, which is great. We then organized some meetings with important stakeholders to see how we can get this message and what we can do to really impact upon the public and on children in a better way. And there was a sugar stakeholder reduction event which was held in June, which we were invited to, as Action on Sugar. It was Public Health England and the UK Health Forum. And what was interesting, they then presented data for the first time, or more recent data, looking at actually what was the average person, Brit in the UK, consuming, how much sugar were they consuming. And actually this is probably an underestimate because sugar surveys, food surveys usually underestimate how much people are eating in terms of food. But what they found was that the average Brit is consuming 2 to 3 times actually what's recommended as a limit. So clearly it's a problem. Again, there was more public awareness, and we had lots of discussions and common agreements that we needed taxes, we needed reformulation, and that went very well. There was a consensus of opinion, yes, sugar is a major issue. There was no fight back from them, from other stakeholders, and that was good. And so what I would like to just briefly talk about now, and I'm going to also a bit of fun as well. There's going to be a video I'm going to show you in a few minutes as well before I finish. But really just some generic lessons about what I learned. I'm an interventional cardiologist. People ask me, why are you interested in population health? Well, actually, population health is if we're really going to combat this problem, we have to look at the public health aspects, because individual choice and targeting individuals will have minimal impact compared to actually regulating industry. And we know that we can learn that from tobacco. So generic lessons from tobacco control is really the 3 A's. So targeting the affordability, the acceptability, and the availability. And we've done that with tobacco. And I wrote about this in the British Medical Journal. How important that is because the biggest decline in mortality from heart disease, death from heart disease, actually was from reduction in tobacco consumption. That's had the biggest impact more than anything else. So taxes, for example, on sugary drinks, and same thing that happened with tobacco. I've had patients come to me who have been previous smokers, and you see that on their records. They've had heart attacks. I see them in the clinic. And I said, have you stopped smoking? And often they say to me, Doc, I can't afford it anymore. It's too expensive. It does have an impact. And the same thing we should apply to junk food, and with sugar in particular. I think sugary drinks are a no-brainer. We should tax sugary drinks. We should obviously the message about the acceptability about its harms should obviously get out there, and that's been happening. And also look at availability. That we shouldn't be serving sugary drinks to bed-bound hospital patients. I've had people coming in, with heart attacks, and then the hospital has a contract that ensures that a trolley goes around even if they're bed-bound, that ensures that they have cans of cola, chocolate bars. And then, it's very difficult to give healthy, positive messages to patients when the hospital's giving them the same foods that brought them in. And also, what about other public health successes? Well, actually, if you look at safe drinking water, sanitation, immunization, seatbelts in cars, advertising bans on tobacco, they happen through public health, not voluntary agreements with the food with those guilty parties, those industries. So really, to almost conclude, the scientific evidence emerges, understanding spreads. Professionals accept this paradigm. Public and politicians become aware, then supportive. Opposition from vested interests is slowly overcome. Regulation is introduced, often strengthened by taxation to reinforce these regulations. And before my final slide, I'm just going to show you a short video. Now, some of you may have seen this before. I apologize if you have. Even if you have, I think you'll enjoy watching it again, and I think it's very relevant to what I've been talking about.
Now, had a fizzy drink today? Did you enjoy the vast quantities of sugar you gulped down? The quickest glance down the high street will tell you how horribly obese much of the population has become. And doctors are increasingly saying that sugary drinks are a main reason, and that they ought, like cigarettes, to be taxed to put people off buying them. It's an idea the drinks manufacturers hate. But campaigners say that also echoes the smoking debate. Look what the tobacco companies said and did. The appeal of fizzy drinks is obvious enough, an instant pleasure that's supposed to perk you up. But the active ingredient is old-fashioned sugar, lots of it. A single can of cola can contain the equivalent of up to 9 teaspoons full of the stuff. As doctors came to realise that cigarettes did not, as their makers often claimed, make you healthy, they're now worrying about fizzy drinks.
One of the biggest problems facing the Western world at the moment is the obesity crisis. Added sugar has no nutritional value whatsoever, and the body does not require any carbohydrate from added sugar, despite the fact that the industry markets these products as being full of energy. Believe me, it's energy you don't want, it's energy you don't need. So we know that the consumption of just one sugary drink, typical of a can of cola, increases the risk of type 2 diabetes by 22%, independent of body weight. And this was a study that was published from Imperial College researchers recently, looking at about 16,000 people throughout Europe. And believe me, type 2 diabetes is a condition you do not want to get if you can avoid it, and is entirely preventable. This is a condition that is associated with heart attacks, strokes, kidney disease, blindness, amputation, increased risk of depression, increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, and even increasing the risk of many cancers.
Coca-Cola is introducing a new smaller can for the UK. Does it demonstrate a new commitment to tackling obesity, or just a cleverer way to sell sugar? Well, James Quincy is the president of Coca-Cola Europe. What good does Coca-Cola do you physically?
I think Coca-Cola, as the introduction said, does have some sugar in it. It is energy. Is it an absolute necessity? No, it's not. Millions of people enjoy it as part of their diet across the UK.
Does have some sugar in it, you say?
It does.
Why don't you say specifically how much sugar there is in this can, for example?
I think if you find, if
on the side you say 13, you have a percentage on there, don't you?
Yes, right here on the front, it quite clearly calls out the amount of sugar in this can of Coke.
And what does it say?
35 grams, which is 6 teaspoons of sugar, which is, you know, about the same amount of calories as a cappuccino or half a croissant. So there is calories. And actually, what we're doing is to say, look, the information is here. We want to actually promote and make sure people
do you imagine people know if they go to the cinema, and they get, this is a small one, and there are big ones here too. You go to the cinema and you get a jug of Coke like this. Do you think people have any idea how much sugar's in it?
And maybe they don't. And I think one of the things we need to do...
Look at this. 23 sachets of sugar in that single container, the equivalent thereof. Now, that is a staggering amount of sugar, isn't it?
That is why we're very focused, as one of the things we're doing, on getting the information out there. We're not trying to hide the information behind what's in a Coca-Cola Classic.
To hide it.
But there's zero sugar in a Coke Zero.
Well, clearly, it's called a Coke Zero. But the Coke Classic, look at this one here. There's 44 packets of sugar in this one. 44!
Indeed there are, and I think what we're saying is, look, we want to make sure that people have the information available to them so that they can make the choices, and if they don't want the big one, then fine, and that clearly is not one that's going to be for everyone. We want to make sure the information is available. We want to make sure there's more availability of more choices, whether it's smaller packages, as you had in your intro.
Yeah, but whether it's 23 in something this size or 44 in something this size, each of which is to be consumed in one single sitting at a cinema, this is staggering, isn't it?
Look, I think we do need to recognise that things need to change, that the bigger cups need to come down. I don't think that we are talking that the world can't change and the world doesn't need to move on. I think what it comes back to is we recognise that we need to play our part in helping to fix this very important issue of obesity. It's something that's come about from, you know, us taking in too many calories and not burning them off with activity, many things over many decades. And we're taking actions. We are promoting the information. As you point out, it is on the can. We're putting it in the advertising. We're increasing choices of the small cans, helping people manage their calories, promoting the zero-calorie options if people are having trouble.
So you accept your role in the obesity epidemic, do you?
I think as a contributor of calories into the British diet, of course we must. I mean, soft drinks, all soft drinks together contribute 2% of the calories. It's a part of it, and therefore we need to accept our role, and we do. And that's why we want to focus on actions that we believe will help bring this crisis under
Isn't
control.
what you're doing very similar to what the tobacco companies did when, after the link with cancer had been established, started then trying to get us all to smoke light cigarettes, as opposed to saying, don't have any of them?
I think there's a very clear distinction between tobacco and anything to do with food and drink, because in the end, there's no amount of tobacco that's good for you. It directly causes some of the disease, no amount. Whereas with food and drink, anything in moderation can work within your lifestyle.
Maybe one of these packets in a cup of tea during the course of the day, or maybe even two. 23 in the smallest container at the cinema.
The reality, people aren't drinking those. And I think what we need to focus on is, you know, if we're trying to solve obesity, it's about information. And if you have the information and you decide, or whoever decides not to have it, absolutely fine. What we're here to do is to get the information into people's hands, help them make the choices that fit their lifestyle, their choices during a week, and also get out there and try and promote activity with some NGO partners to try and help the other side of the equation and burn off some of those calories. Because when you actually look out there and say, has anyone actually solved the crisis? Because sometimes we look at things and say, well, you know, what will work? But what's important is to look at some of those examples where things have actually happened. There's an approach called EPOD out there, started in France, moved across Europe, is now spreading across the world, where they brought down childhood obesity by 20%. And it's not by taking some eye-catching or simple measures. They did a number of things, bringing in private companies, health companies, local government communities, and brought down childhood obesity by 20%.
Thank you very much.
So, just to finish, science isn't sufficient. Remember what happened to John Yudkin. Sugar, as time has definitely come, and there needs to be a strategy essential to influence the decision makers based upon the 3 A's that I talked about earlier. So, we've got tobacco control, but it took 50 years. 50 years, and millions died in those 50 years because big tobacco played dirty. Let's not allow the same thing to happen with the sugar industry. Thank you.